The rain turned to sleet as Florence Navarro pressed herself against the crumbling mercantile wall, her threadbare shawl doing nothing against the bitter Montana wind that howled through Bozeman's Main Street like a living thing bent on destroying her. She had been waiting 3 hours for the stagecoach that would take her back to Helena, but the driver had taken one look at the darkening sky and declared he would not risk the mountain pass tonight, leaving her stranded in a town where she knew no one and had exactly 17 cents to her name. The broken awning above her head rattled violently, one corner completely torn away, offering no protection from the freezing precipitation that soaked through her worn calico dress and made her teeth chatter so hard she bit her tongue. She closed her eyes against the sting of ice and wondered if this was how her story would end, frozen to death at 22 years old in a town that did not even know her name. "Miss, you cannot stay out here." The voice cut through the wind, deep and concerned, and Florence forced her eyes open to see a tall man standing before her, his broad-brimmed hat pulled low against the weather. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat that looked gloriously warm, and even through the sleet she could make out strong features and eyes that seemed genuinely worried. "You will catch your death in this storm." "The boarding house is full," Florence managed through chattering teeth, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I have no place to go until morning." The man stepped closer, and she could see him better now despite the failing light. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a face weathered by sun and wind but kind in its lines. "My cabin is warm and safe," he said, and there was no artifice in his voice, no underlying suggestion that made her afraid. "It is just up the ridge, about a mile from here. I have a good fire going, and my sister left plenty of blankets when she married last month. You are welcome to shelter there until the storm passes." Florence knew she should be wary. A decent woman did not go off alone with a strange man to an isolated cabin, no matter how kind his eyes seemed. But feeling was leaving her fingers, and she could no longer sense her toes in her thin boots. The choice was freeze to death maintaining propriety or risk this stranger's offer and possibly see another sunrise. "I do not have money to pay you," she said, because honesty seemed important in this moment. "I am not asking for payment." He extended his hand. "My name is Connor Young. I run cattle in the valley south of town. I have a reputation you can check if you want to walk down to the sheriff's office first, but I would not recommend staying out here much longer." She looked into his eyes and made her decision. "Florence Navarro," she said, placing her frozen hand in his warm one, "and I accept your kindness." Connor did not waste time. He led her to where his horse stood tied outside the saloon, a sturdy bay gelding with kind eyes. He mounted first, then pulled her up behind him with easy strength, arranging his coat around both of them as much as possible. Florence wrapped her arms around his waist, because there was no other way to stay on the horse, and felt the solid warmth of him even through his layers of clothing. She pressed her face against his back as they rode into the storm, and tried not to think about how improper this all was, or how her mother would have fainted dead away at the sight. The ride took longer than a mile should have, but the wind fought them every step, and Connor guided the horse carefully along a path Florence could not even see. By the time they reached the cabin, full darkness had fallen, and the sleet had turned to proper snow, huge wet flakes that stuck to everything. Connor dismounted and lifted her down, and she discovered her legs would barely hold her weight. "Easy now," he said, keeping one arm around her waist as he pushed open the cabin door. Warmth rushed out to meet them, blessed and beautiful, and Florence nearly wept from the relief of it. The cabin was a single large room, but it was well built and clearly maintained with care. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a genuine fire crackling merrily within it. There was a bed in one corner, neatly made, a table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and pegs on the wall holding various coats and gear. It was a bachelor's dwelling, but cleaner than she had expected, and the warmth seeped into her bones like a prayer answered. "Sit here by the fire," Connor said, guiding her to one of the chairs that he dragged closer to the hearth. "I need to see to my horse, but I will be right back. Do not try to warm up too fast, or you will hurt worse." He was gone before she could respond, ducking back into the storm. Florence sat in the chair and held her shaking hands toward the fire, feeling the painful prickle as circulation slowly returned. She looked around the cabin with more attention now, noting the books on one shelf, actual books, and the carefully mended curtains at the single window. A man who read and mended his own curtains was not the rough cowboy she had expected. Connor returned after what felt like both an eternity and mere seconds, stamping snow from his boots and shaking it from his hat. He hung his coat on a peg and then moved efficiently around the cabin, pulling a blanket from a trunk at the foot of the bed and draping it around her shoulders, setting a kettle of water to heat on a hook over the fire, and checking the supplies on his shelves. "When did you last eat?" he asked without turning around. Florence tried to remember. "Yesterday evening, I think. I had some bread and cheese at the last stage stop." He made a sound that might have been disapproval but said nothing, just began pulling out supplies. She watched as he efficiently prepared a meal, slicing salt pork into a pan, setting cornbread to warm near the fire, and opening a jar of what looked like preserved tomatoes. The smells made her stomach cramp with hunger she had been trying to ignore. "You can change behind that screen if you want," Connor said, nodding toward a folding screen in the corner near the bed that she had not noticed before. "My sister left some clothes in the trunk. You should get out of that wet dress." The thought of dry clothes was almost as appealing as the warmth. Florence stood on unsteady legs and made her way to the trunk. Behind the screen, she peeled off her wet dress, stockings, and undergarments with fumbling fingers, then found a simple cotton shift and a wool dress that was only slightly too large for her frame. There were thick socks as well, and she pulled them on gratefully. When she emerged, Connor had set the table with 2 plates and was dishing up the food. They ate in silence at first, Florence too focused on getting warm food into her body to make conversation. The meal was simple but good, and she cleaned her plate without embarrassment. Connor refilled it without asking, and she managed half of the second helping before her shrunken stomach protested. "Thank you," she said when she finally set down her fork. "You saved my life tonight." Connor shook his head. "You would have found somewhere. The mercantile owner would have let you in eventually." "Would he?" Florence met his eyes. "I am a stranger with no money and no references. Old man Garrett looked at me like I was trouble when I asked about the boarding house. Garrett looks at everyone like that." But Connor's expression said he knew she was probably right. "What brings you to Bozeman anyway? You said you were waiting for a stage to Helena." Florence wrapped her hands around the tin cup of water he had given her. "I was working as a teacher in Virginia City. The school board decided they wanted someone with more formal credentials and let me go. I have a cousin in Helena who said she could help me find work as a seamstress. I am good with a needle. Virginia City to Helena by way of Bozeman is not the most direct route. It is when you can only afford the cheapest ticket and have to take whatever stages have open seats." She heard the defensiveness in her own voice and softened her tone. "I am not running from anything illegal, if that is what you are wondering. I can give you my cousin's name and address if you want to verify my story." Connor held up a hand. "I believe you. I was just curious." He stood and began clearing the plates. "The question now is what we do about sleeping arrangements. You take the bed. I will make a pallet by the fire." "I cannot take your bed. You have already done so much. You can and you will. I have slept on worse than a floor, and I have enough blankets to keep comfortable." His tone brooked no argument. "The storm is going to get worse before it gets better. You might be here more than one night." Florence felt a flutter of something in her chest that might have been anxiety or might have been something else entirely. Spending multiple days alone in a cabin with a man she had just met should have terrified her, but somehow Connor Young did not frighten her at all. Instead, she felt safer than she had in months, possibly years. She helped him clean up from the meal, moving around the small cabin in a companionable silence. Connor pulled blankets and furs from the trunk and made himself a pallet that actually looked quite comfortable near the hearth. Florence changed back into the borrowed shift behind the screen and climbed into the bed, which smelled of cedar and something else, something masculine and clean that must have been Connor himself. "Blow out the lamp when you are ready," Connor said from his place by the fire. "Sleep well, Miss Navarro." "Florence, please," she said. "And thank you again, Connor." The sound of her name on his lips warmed her more than the blankets. She blew out the lamp and lay in the darkness, listening to the wind howl outside and the fire crackle in the hearth, and felt the strangest sense of peace settle over her. When Florence woke, pale gray light filtered through the window, and the smell of coffee filled the cabin. She sat up to find Connor already dressed and moving around quietly, clearly trying not to wake her. The storm still raged outside, snow now clearly visible whipping past the window in horizontal sheets. "Good morning," she said, and he turned with a smile that did something unexpected to her heartbeat. "Morning. Coffee is ready if you want some." He poured her a cup without waiting for an answer. "Storm is worse than I expected. We are snowed in pretty thoroughly." Florence took the coffee and wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "How long do you think it will last?" "Hard to say. Could be another day or two before it is safe to travel, longer before the stagecoach runs again." He handed her a plate with fried eggs and more cornbread. "I hope you did not have urgent business in Helena. My cousin is not expecting me on any particular day. I told her I would arrive when I could." Florence took a bite of egg. "What about you? Will your cattle be all right? They are in the winter pasture with shelter." "My partner, Marcus, is watching them. He knows I came into town for supplies and will not expect me back until the weather clears." Connor sat across from her with his own plate. "So we just need to wait it out." Being trapped in close quarters with a virtual stranger should have been awkward, but somehow it was not. After breakfast, Connor produced a worn deck of cards and taught Florence a game he said he had learned from a gambler in Deadwood. She beat him 3 hands out of 5, and he laughed with genuine delight at her card sense. They talked about small things, safe things. He told her about growing up in Ohio and coming west after the war to make his fortune in cattle. She told him about her childhood in Santa Fe and her father's dream that she would have an education, a dream that died with him when she was 16. "Is that why you became a teacher?" Connor asked. "To honor his dream, partly. And partly because I love learning, love watching children's faces when they finally understand something new." Florence stared into her coffee cup. "I was not trained formally. My father taught me everything he knew, and he knew a great deal. He was a scholar before he came west. But the school board in Virginia City wanted someone from a normal school back east, someone with certificates." "Their loss," Connor said firmly. "Certificates do not make someone a good teacher. Heart does." The simple conviction in his voice made Florence's eyes sting with unexpected tears. No one had said anything like that to her when she lost her position. The school board had been coldly polite. The other teachers had been awkwardly sympathetic, and the parents had said nothing at all. The day passed in strange, comfortable domesticity. Connor mended some harness leather while Florence repaired a tear in one of his shirts that he had been ignoring for weeks. They spoke of books they had read, places they had been, dreams they harbored. Florence learned that Connor wanted to build his herd up enough to bring his mother out from Ohio, that he loved the mountains but sometimes missed trees that turned colors in fall, that he had never expected to find contentment in Montana, but somehow had anyway. "What about you?" Connor asked as the early winter darkness began to fall. "What do you dream about?" Florence set down the shirt she had been mending. "Security, I suppose. A place that is truly mine where I cannot be dismissed or displaced. Work that matters. A home." She laughed a little bitterly. "Simple dreams, but they seem impossibly far away sometimes." "They are not impossible," Connor said quietly. "You are young yet and clearly capable. You will find your place." That night followed the same pattern as the first, but Florence lay awake longer, listening to Connor's steady breathing from his pallet by the fire. She thought about how easy it was to talk to him, how safe she felt in his presence, how her eyes kept tracking him as he moved around the cabin. She was not naive enough to mistake gratitude for deeper feelings, but she suspected there might be something more developing, something that both thrilled and terrified her. The storm continued through the next day, and then another. They fell into rhythms, taking turns cooking, reading aloud to each other from Connor's small collection of books, talking about everything and nothing. Connor told her about losing 3 steers to a mountain lion last summer and tracking the cat for 2 weeks before finally scaring it off into the higher peaks. Florence told him about the little girl in Virginia City who could not read a word in September, but was devouring books by Christmas. They shared stories and silences, and Florence felt herself drawn to him more with each passing hour. On the third night, as they sat by the fire after supper, Connor suddenly said, "I need to be honest with you about something." Florence's heart seized. "What is it?" "I've been alone here for a long time. My sister got married and moved to her husband's place. My partner Marcus has his own cabin. I see people in town, but it is not the same as having someone to talk to, really talk to." He looked at her directly. "These few days with you have been the best I have had in months, maybe years. I know you will leave when the storm breaks, and you should. You have your own plans and your own life, but I wanted you to know that your company has meant a great deal to me." Florence felt warmth spread through her chest. "It has meant a great deal to me as well. I have not felt this comfortable with anyone since my father died. You have been nothing but kind and respectful, and I do not know how I will ever repay you." "There is nothing to repay." Connor leaned forward. "But I would like to ask permission to write to you in Helena. If you would not mind corresponding with a cowboy who reads too much and probably cannot spell half the words he wants to use." Florence laughed. "Your spelling is better than mine, I suspect. And yes, I would very much like to exchange letters." Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of possibility. They did not touch, did not move closer, but Florence felt the pull between them like a physical thing. The storm finally broke on the 4th morning, leaving behind a world transformed into white silence. The sun emerged bright and blinding on the snow, and Connor declared that by afternoon the main road would be passable enough to get her back to town. Florence should have been relieved. Instead, she felt a strange grief at the thought of leaving this cabin, this space where she had felt so unexpectedly at peace. She dressed in her own clothes, now fully dried, and helped Connor prepare a final meal together. They rode down to town in the early afternoon, Florence once again seated behind Connor on his horse, her arms around his waist. She memorized the feel of him, the warmth of his body, the steady way he handled the horse through the deep snow. Bozeman came into view too soon, the town coming back to life as people dug out from the storm. Connor brought her to the boarding house first, where Mrs. Kelly apologized profusely for having no room during the storm, but now had a bed available if Miss Navarro needed it. Florence paid for one night with coins Connor had quietly pressed into her hand despite her protests. Then he took her to the stage office, where the clerk confirmed that a stage would leave for Helena the following morning. They stood outside the stage office, suddenly awkward now that they were back in civilization. "Write to me in care of the Bozeman post office," Connor said. "I come to town every few weeks for supplies." "I will write as soon as I arrive in Helena," Florence promised. "Thank you for everything, Connor. You truly saved me." He looked like he wanted to say something more, but there were people around, eyes watching with curiosity. Instead, he just tipped his hat. "Safe travels, Florence. I hope you find what you are looking for in Helena." She watched him ride away and felt something tear inside her chest. She had known this man for 4 days. It made no sense that she should feel this bereft at parting from him. But she did. Helena proved to be everything Florence had hoped and nothing she wanted. Her cousin Marie was warm and welcoming, helping her find work as a seamstress in a shop that made dresses for the city's growing population of wealthy wives. The work was steady and the pay adequate. Florence found a small room to rent in a respectable boarding house. By all measures, she should have been content. Instead, she found herself thinking constantly of a cabin in the mountains and a man with kind eyes who read books and mended his own curtains. She wrote to Connor as promised, a carefully proper letter describing her journey and thanking him again for his hospitality. His reply came 3 weeks later, equally proper but warmer, telling her about the cattle coming through the winter well and asking about her work. They continued to write through the winter and into spring. The letters grew longer, more personal. Connor wrote about his dreams of expanding his operation, his worries about his mother's failing health in Ohio, his thoughts on the books he was reading. Florence wrote about the satisfaction of creating beautiful things with her needle, her frustration with customers who changed their minds repeatedly, her loneliness in a city full of people. In May, Connor wrote that he would be bringing cattle to the stockyards in Helena in early June, if she would care to meet him for dinner at a respectable restaurant. Florence read that letter 17 times before composing her response, trying to sound casual when her heart was racing at the thought of seeing him again. They met at the Grand Hotel dining room on a warm June evening. Florence wore a dress she had made herself, pale blue cotton that brought out her eyes. Connor wore a suit that looked uncomfortable on him but showed he had made an effort. They were awkward for the first few minutes, the easy comfort of the cabin lost in the formality of the setting. But then, Connor told a story about a calf getting stuck in the creek, and Florence laughed the way she had by his fireside, and the awkwardness dissolved. They talked through dinner and long after, until the waiters began giving them pointed looks. Connor walked her back to her boarding house in the soft twilight, and at the door he took her hand. "I have thought about you every day since the storm," he said quietly. "I know it is too soon, and I am just a cowboy with big dreams and little to show for them yet, but I care for you, Florence. More than I have cared for anyone." Florence felt tears prick her eyes. "I have thought of you constantly as well. I thought perhaps it was just gratitude or the strangeness of those days in the cabin. But it has not faded. If anything, it has grown stronger." "I want to court you properly," Connor said. "I know the distance makes it difficult, but I can come to Helena every few weeks. We can take time to know each other better, to be certain. I will not rush you or pressure you, but I needed you to know my intentions." "I would like that very much," Florence said softly. He lifted her hand to his lips, a gentle kiss that sent warmth flooding through her. Then he stepped back, tipped his hat, and walked away into the night. Their courtship unfolded through that summer and fall and stolen days when Connor could get away from his ranch. They walked along Helena's streets, had picnics in the foothills, attended church together. Connor met Marie, who approved of him thoroughly. Florence learned more about his life, meeting his partner Marcus when she traveled to Bozeman once in August, seeing the ranch and cattle he spoke of so often in his letters. In October, Connor received word that his mother had passed away in Ohio. Florence held him as he wept for the woman he had not seen in 5 years, the mother he had been working so hard to bring west. She sat with him in his grief and said little, knowing sometimes presence was more important than words. In November, as the first snows began to fall, Connor took Florence to the cabin where they had first truly met. He had brought food and supplies, making it clear this was a planned outing, properly chaperoned by the understanding that Marcus knew where they were and expected them back by nightfall. They sat by the fire that had warmed Florence on that desperate night nearly a year ago. Connor took her hands in his. "This place is special to me now," he said. "It is where I found you, where I first began to understand what my life was missing." What was it missing? Florence asked, though she thought she knew. "You, someone to share it with, someone to build dreams with instead of just dreaming alone." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I am still just a cowboy with more ambition than assets, but I love you, Florence Navarro. I have loved you since you beat me at cards in this cabin and laughed with such delight. Will you marry me? Will you make a life with me here in Montana?" Florence looked at the simple gold band in the box, then at the man holding it, the man who had saved her from freezing and then captured her heart so completely she could not imagine life without him. "Yes," she said, joy flooding through her. "Yes, Connor, I will marry you." He slipped the ring on her finger and kissed her, a kiss that was both gentle and passionate, full of promise and longing. Florence kissed him back and felt everything in her life click into place, as though all the wandering and uncertainty had been leading her to exactly this moment, this man, this love. They married in December in a small church in Bozeman. Marie came from Helena, and Marcus stood up as Connor's best man. Florence wore a dress she had sewn herself, cream-colored wool with lace at the collar, and carried winter greenery since flowers were impossible to find. Connor wore his suit and looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. The winter was long but joyful. Florence moved into the cabin that had sheltered her that stormy night, and together they made it a home. She sewed curtains for the windows and coverlets for the bed. Connor built her a bookshelf and began filling it with volumes he bought whenever he went to town. They read together by firelight, cooked together, talked for hours about everything and nothing. In spring, Florence planted a garden near the cabin. Connor expanded his herd, and Florence helped with the ranch work when she was needed, learning to manage cattle and horses, proving herself capable and tireless. Marcus became a dear friend, often joining them for dinners where they would argue good-naturedly about politics and books. In the summer of 1878, Florence gave birth to their first child, a son they named Matthew after Connor's father. Connor held the tiny boy with tears streaming down his face, and Florence felt her heart expand in ways she had not known possible. Life was not always easy. There were harsh winters and dry summers, cattle lost to predators and illness, lean times when they worried about making it through. But they faced everything together, Connor and Florence, partners in every sense. They built their ranch slowly and steadily, adding to their herd, improving their cabin, making a life. 2 years after Matthew came a daughter, Sarah, red-faced and loud and perfect. Florence taught both children to read before they were 5, passing on her father's love of learning. Connor taught them to ride and to handle animals with respect. They grew up knowing they were loved beyond measure. In 1883, Connor bought the land adjacent to their original homestead, doubling their ranch's size. Marcus married a widow from town and built his own house on the property, and their families grew close, children playing together while adults worked side by side. Through it all, Connor and Florence never lost the connection forged in that cabin during the storm. They still read together by the fire on winter nights. They still talked for hours about dreams and hopes. Connor still looked at Florence like she was the most precious thing in the world, and Florence still felt her heart skip when he walked into a room. Years passed in the way they do, marked by seasons and children growing and the slow, steady work of building something lasting. Matthew grew tall like his father and took naturally to ranching. Sarah proved to have her mother's way with a needle and her father's head for business. In 1889, a third child arrived unexpectedly, another son they named James, and Connor joked that they were starting over. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Connor took Florence back to the cabin. They had built a larger house closer to the main pastures by then, a proper home with multiple rooms and glass windows. But they had kept the cabin, using it as a lined shack for hands watching the winter pastures. For this night, Connor had cleaned it and stocked it, brought blankets and food and made it cozy. "Do you remember the storm?" he asked as they sat by the fire, much as they had all those years ago. "Every detail," Florence said, leaning against him. "I remember thinking I might die. I remember you appearing like an answer to prayer. I remember thinking you were the kindest man I had ever met. I remember seeing you there, trying so hard to be brave while you were freezing to death. I remember bringing you here and feeling something shift in my world. I just did not recognize it yet as falling in love." Connor kissed the top of her head. "I would live through 1,000 storms if they all led me to you." Florence turned in his arms and kissed him properly, still in love after 15 years, still grateful for the chance encounter that had changed both their lives. "We have built something good here, you and I." "We have," Connor agreed, "and we are not done yet." They were not done. The years continued to unfold, bringing joys and sorrows as all lives do. They lost Marcus to a heart attack in 1893, and grieved hard for the friend who had been like a brother. They celebrated when Matthew married a rancher's daughter from Livingston and brought her home to the ranch. They welcomed grandchildren, 4 of them in quick succession, and Connor proved to be as gentle a grandfather as he had been a father. Sarah moved to Bozeman and opened a dress shop that became the finest in the territory. Then the state after Montana gained statehood in 1889. She married late, at 31, to a lawyer who appreciated her independence and business sense. James proved to be the wanderer of the family, heading to college in the East and eventually becoming a teacher, making Florence proud beyond words. Through it all, the ranch prospered. Connor's early dreams proved achievable through hard work and Florence's careful management of their finances. They became respected members of the community, known for fair dealing and generosity. Connor served on the town council for a term, and Florence helped establish a proper school in Bozeman, serving on the school board and ensuring that teachers were valued and fairly compensated regardless of their formal credentials. In 1903, on a spring evening warm with promise, Connor and Florence sat on the porch of their home watching the sun set over the mountains. They were both in their 60s now, hair gray and faces lined but still strong, still healthy, still deeply in love. "Do you ever regret it?" Connor asked. "Giving up your plans for Helena? Choosing this life instead?" Florence took his hand, the same hand that had pulled her onto his horse during that long-ago storm. "Not for a single moment. This is exactly the life I was meant to live. You are exactly who I was meant to love." "I was terrified that night bringing you to the cabin," Connor admitted. "I knew it was improper, knew people might talk, but I could not leave you there to freeze. And then when we started talking, I remember thinking I had never met anyone like you. Smart and brave and kind. I fell in love so fast it scared me. I fell fast too. I told myself it was gratitude, but I knew better. You saw me, Connor, not just some stranded woman, but me, truly me. You valued my thoughts and my dreams. You made me feel worth something at a time when I felt worth nothing at all." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the colors change across the sky. Around them was the ranch they had built together, the family they had created, the life they had forged from one chance encounter on a storm-torn night. Matthew and his wife lived in the new house they had built on the north section, raising their 4 children and managing most of the day-to-day ranch work now. Sarah visited often from Bozeman with her husband and 2 children. James was teaching at the university in Missoula, but came home for summers. The ranch would continue after they were gone. Florence knew, passed down through generations who would never know how close their existence had come to not happening at all. "We should write it down," Florence said suddenly, "our story, so the grandchildren know how we met." Connor laughed. "They would never believe it, too much like a fairy tale. But it is true. Every word. You found me freezing under a broken awning. You said your cabin was warm and safe. And you gave me so much more than shelter from a storm, Connor. You gave me a home, a family, a life filled with love and purpose. You gave me everything." Connor pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, both of them watching the light fade from the sky. They had built something real and lasting, had loved each other through decades of joys and sorrows, had created a legacy that would outlive them both. Years later, when both Connor and Florence had passed on, peacefully and within months of each other, their children found a journal Florence had kept. In it, she had written the story of that storm and the cabin and the cowboy who had saved her life in every way a person could be saved. She had written about their courtship and marriage, about building the ranch and raising their children, about a love that had sustained them through everything life brought their way. Sarah had the journal copied and gave it to each of her siblings and all the grandchildren. It became a family treasure, passed down through generations, the story of how Connor and Florence found each other in a Montana storm and built an empire of love that lasted beyond their own lifetimes. The cabin where it all began still stood on the ranch, preserved by the family as a reminder of where everything started. Great-grandchildren played there in summer, and sometimes couples newly in love would ask permission to spend a night there, hoping some of that original magic might bless their own unions. The story became legend in the family. It was told at weddings and anniversaries, whenever the family gathered for holidays or reunions. It was the story of how one act of kindness on a frozen night had changed the course of so many lives, how a chance encounter had become an enduring love, how 2 people who might never have met had found each other at exactly the right moment and built something beautiful together. Connor Young and Florence Navarro had loved deeply and lived fully. They had faced hardships and celebrated triumphs. They had raised children and built a successful ranch and contributed to their community. But more than any of that, they had found in each other the home they had both been seeking, and they had held onto it with both hands for the rest of their lives. In the end, that was the true story. Not just of a rescue from a storm, but of 2 hearts finding each other and choosing, every single day, to build a life together. It was a story of love enduring, of promises kept, of dreams shared and achieved. It was a story that began with Connor seeing Florence shivering under a broken awning and offering her warmth and safety. But it became so much more than that simple beginning. It became a love story for the ages, told and retold, remembered and honored, a testament to the power of kindness and the miracle of finding exactly the right person at exactly the right time. And though Connor and Florence eventually returned to the earth they had worked and loved, their story lived on, inspiring generations to believe in the possibility of true love and the power of one compassionate act to change everything.